been 1 year shooting with the Ricoh GR III, and I've taken it everywhere with me in my day-to-day. I've traveled with it across Canada and the States. Yeah, it's just always on me, and I really have not been babying this camera. And over the past year, I've taken about 13,000 photos with it. At the start of this year, I made a first impressions video on this camera, and a lot of those thoughts in that video still holds true today. And I remember saying in that video that this probably wouldn't be my main camera, and I was wrong. I get it now, and this has definitely been the camera that I use the most and probably my favorite. It's a camera that has changed the way that I shoot. I feel like I am much more fluid with my photography now, and looking back at all of my photos, 80% of my photos, I am just, taking photos on the go, and I've gotten really comfortable with the 28mm focal length. At first, I had a really hard time struggling with it because I primarily shot with a 35mm focal length, and that was what I was comfortable with. And going from a 35 to 28, it just felt really wide. And I feel like in some circumstances, I really miss the 35 just for more composed compositions. But I feel like as I spent more time with the 28mm, I was able to adapt. And I do really like the look, and I find it fun to use when you're close up with your subjects, or even just going out with friends and family. But anyways, I'll get more into focal length later in the video. But yeah, this camera allows me to kind of pre-compose quickly, and I feel like I'm a lot more reactive with this camera, and I'm more compelled to take photos without overthinking, because it's just it's just fun to use. It's like a little point and shoot. And although I am a little bit more reactive with this camera, I always find that I can always take my time to compose slower moments too, so no problem with that. And yeah, when I look back at all my photos, I can definitely tell that my style has gotten a lot more snapshotty, a little less perfect, a little more casual, and I really like it. It makes it feel a little bit more personal. And yeah, it just kind of reminded me of why I love photography, because it's just fun to take photos. It's just fun to press the shutter. But yeah, what I really like about this is that the start time is really fast. So if I press the button right here, it just turns on right away, and I'm ready to take photos. So I don't mind. I'm turning it on and off between shots. I usually find that I'm usually waiting for a moment, and when I can see it happening in front of my eyes, I just turn it on, and I can easily take a photo, and then I'll turn it off and wait for the next moment. Yeah, because I am constantly turning it on and off, I actually find that the battery does last me the whole day usually. And if it's a pretty heavy shooting day, then I'll have to use 2 batteries. But that's just the way I shoot. I have no problems with the battery capacity. Besides, the battery is so freaking small that it's so easy to bring around with you. And I'm usually always carrying a sling with me anyway, so I don't mind bringing extra batteries. But I know that if I'm just going out for a little bit, I have no problem just bringing this camera, and I don't have to worry about a second battery. But of course, it depends on what kind of shooter you are. I know there are a few people out there who like to shoot with this camera turned on all the time, and with that, you will need a lot of batteries for that. I love this camera. It just works. It's small, it's discreet, and I think it produces beautiful images, and I really love the colors that I get out of it. I love that I don't always have the mental load of carrying a big camera, or worrying about being seen. And when people do see me with this little camera, I just look like a freaking tourist, and I like that. I like not being noticed, and it allows me to produce better images because I am just in a good headspace, and I'm not worrying about external factors, and I can just focus on creating images. It's also super quiet too, so I don't have to worry about people looking my way when I do press the shutter. But yeah, I think that is the most powerful thing about this camera. It's that I am always making photos. Some of my favorite photos from this year have been taken with this camera, and it's just incredibly sharp, and I love the way that the lens and the sensor render light. In my experience, this is probably one of the most filmic digital cameras that I've used, and the colors that just come out of this camera are just really beautiful, and I find that the files are really easy to work with. I always shoot in RAW just because I prefer to post-process my images, but yeah, I actually find those files easier to work with than Fujifilm files. When it comes to, high ISO and low light, then yeah, it's not as flexible. But majority of the time, I really do like working with the GR3 files. I think there's something about the highlight roll-off and the way it handles shadows that feels very filmic. So even if I'm shooting like midday, I do find that I do kind of prefer the images that come out of this with the way that the sensor renders light compared to, other cameras. With the Ricoh GR3, I love using the positive film simulation. I'm always using that as a base when I am editing my photos. And I love it so much that I even try and go and replicate it on my other cameras. And so there's this base preset that you can get from Cobalt Image that allows you to replicate, any of the Ricoh GR film simulations, and it's calibrated to your camera's color. So yeah, that's what I've been trying to do with my other cameras. So like my Fujifilm X-T4 or my Fujifilm X Pro 2, I'll just try and replicate that. I find that it's not exactly one-to-one like my Ricoh GR3's film simulation, but it gets pretty close and I really, really like it. So in my first impressions video, I did say that the autofocus sucked. And well, it does, especially if you use the default settings. Since switching to select autofocus, I found that it actually works a lot better and it's been much more reliable. So yeah, rather than letting the camera decide what will be in focus, you can use that center focus to kind of choose your subject and focus on that and then recompose. And I have found that this has worked for me like 90% of the time. The camera does definitely struggle with autofocus in low light, and at that point, autofocus is kind of useless and you want to try and use manual focus, or rather snap focus, to measure the distance to capture that photo at night. But I know that's not always the best case. When it comes to snap focus, I actually haven't used it that much. I found that the autofocus works for me for the way that I shoot. Like sometimes I will use snap focus on a hard press if I need to capture something really, really quickly, or if I need to use a flash, then make sure I can measure my distance. But other than that, the autofocus works for me like a lot of the time. Okay, so as for build quality and durability, this camera has held up pretty well, surprisingly. I've just been kind of throwing it in my bags, in my slings, and in my pockets all the time. And I used to have a lens cap for this, the JJC lens cap. And at first I used it because I wanted to protect the camera from dust, but I figured like over time I was just not really getting photos because it just caused too much friction, and so gave up on that, started just putting this directly into my pockets, and I am taking this out more often and taking more pictures. Looking at this camera, like aside from like a few scuffs on my hot shoe over here, the camera looks in really, really good condition. It's honestly been pretty durable with the way that I've just kind of thrown it into my bags. But I feel like if I were to have dropped this like on the floor free-handedly, I am not so confident that this would survive. But thankfully, I have not dropped it. This front ring did fall off for me at some point in the beginning of the year, and I actually had to replace it with a third-party ring. And yeah, I found that the original front ring fell off pretty easily, or it came loose pretty easily. So when I bought this third-party ring, it actually stays on pretty tight, and I'll try and link it below, but I think last I checked it wasn't available. But I think you can get third-party rings from like JJC or even from like AliExpress. Now let's talk about the most controversial thing when it comes to Ricoh GR cameras: dust. Yes, I do have dust on my sensor after a year of heavy use, and it's very minimal, and I've never noticed it in my actual photos. It hasn't bothered me. At the end of the day, I would much rather have a camera always on me and to deal with a little bit of dust than to kind of baby it and miss moments due to having like a lens cap on it or having it stored in a case. Think about it, I took over 13,000 photos this year, and even just missing like 25% of that would mean that I would have missed over 3,000 photos. Yeah, I mean, I bought this camera knowing that it will probably not last me forever, but that's just the nature of it. It has moving parts and eventually it's going to fail. So it's fragile by nature, but for me, I think the trade-off is worth it because of its small size. I've been able to capture priceless memories with it just because it's always on me. Let's talk about focal length. I chose the 28mm over the 40mm just for flexibility. I know that like with the 28mm, I can always crop the photo if I needed to, but like if I had a 40mm, I knew that I wouldn't have been able to, step back in tight spaces, and so I wanted that camera to be able to capture, you know, photos anywhere. And so I don't regret that choice at all. I feel like I use this camera a lot for like everyday moments, so like going to like parties, dinners, you know, birthdays, and even for travel. 28mm feels perfect. Moments with people, I feel like the 40mm would definitely have been too tight. There are moments where I wish I had a tighter focal length, especially when I'm a little bit far from a subject. And so because of the 28mm focal length, which is really wide, it will make everything appear smaller in the image. But where the 28mm really shines is when you can get really close to your subject, and so it feels really immersive, and it's a really unique perspective. But yeah, there's pros and cons to every focal length, and I really appreciate how 28mm feels really loose. I feel like I've shot with it so much that like sometimes I don't need to look at the LCD screen to compose. I have a general understanding of where I need to be, and so I can just usually aim, and I'll usually get my subjects in frame. But yeah, if you're planning on using this camera for more composed images and less for everyday life, then I would probably recommend the 40mm. Okay, so let's talk about the flaws, because I know this camera isn't for everybody. In my opinion, I don't think there's that many. I really don't mind the small battery, the fixed screen, or the lack of a viewfinder. The reason that it misses out on some of those features is because it is so small and compact, so there's always going to be trade-offs. And sometimes I do wish that the LCD could get a little bit brighter, especially in harsh midday sun. Sometimes it is just a little bit hard to see, and I'm literally trying to just shade the screen to see what's in frame. They did address it in the Ricoh GR IV, where the screen is a little bit brighter. But yeah, I mean, for the most part, it hasn't gone really in my way. It still works. My other complaint with it is autofocus, especially in low lights. Low light performance is also not the greatest, as you can get really noisy. I find that even shooting at 6400 on like not even at an extreme low light scenario, it can introduce a lot of like color noise, and Lightroom's denoising feature doesn't work with the Ricoh GR III, just because I think the Ricoh GR III does have some denoising processing in camera, and so that's not letting it enable. But yeah, that does kind of suck, but for the most part, it hasn't bothered me too much, just because like I don't mind a little bit of grain and I don't mind a little bit of noise. But yeah, when it comes to low light, I do try and use the flash, and I do like the images that I get with the flash. It's been helpful. One thing I do want to point out about this camera is that this camera does freeze up a little bit. It's only happened like a handful of times, but sometimes the camera will kind of retract out like this and it will freeze like this, and the only way to kind of get rid of that is to like take out the battery and to put it back in, and then it'll start working. So yeah, something to note. Now, is this camera worth it for the price? At this time of posting, the camera goes around 1400 Canadian for the Ricoh GR III, or even 1900 for the new Ricoh GR IV. Objectively, probably not. At this price point, you can get cameras with way more features like interchangeable lenses, weather sealing, better autofocus, and like better battery life. But that being said, you probably won't find another camera this size with an APS-C size sensor with this level of image quality. It also has in-body stabilization and an ND filter, which is pretty rare for something this small. Yeah, it's hard to justify, but emotionally though, I think it is 100% worth it for me. It's just so easy to carry, so easy to use, and it's genuinely really fun to shoot with. Just having this much image quality in your pocket just lowers the mental pressure. It makes photography a little bit more casual, and it also means that more of my everyday life is being captured. There was one time I accidentally left my GR in someone else's backpack for about a week and a half, and I was genuinely devastated. I was really sad, and I had never actually felt that way about any other camera. And this camera has become a huge part of my routine. I always take it out with me, and it has become like my photo diary camera. But during that time without this camera, I was so much more aware using my other cameras with like the size and the attention that they bring. And yeah, it really got into my head about it, and it just made me realize like how powerful this thing is, because it's incredibly discreet. Nobody really notices it. It definitely makes me feel safer taking photos. It almost feels like a little shield, and it also makes me look like a tourist, which is A+. So yeah, I think the GR is always going to be in my camera kit for the foreseeable future. It's easy to use, it doesn't get in the way, and I have a lot of fun shooting with it. I love the images that come out of it, and that's what this is all about anyways, right? But yeah, that's it for this video, and see you in the next one.